In 1943, while the Second World War was still raging across Europe, the United States was searching for something every Air Force wanted, but no one had fully mastered: a reliable way to make a weapon guide itself after it had been released. Bombers could carry enormous destructive power, but once a bomb left the aircraft, gravity, wind, visibility, altitude, speed, and human error all began to decide its fate. The problem was not simply how to build a larger explosive. The problem was how to make that explosive arrive at the exact place commanders intended. Inside this world of urgent experiments, one proposal seemed almost impossible to take seriously. It did not depend on a pilot, a radio beam, or an electronic brain. It depended on a living creature placed inside the nose of a weapon. The proposed guidance system had eyes, feathers, and a beak. It was a pigeon, trained to recognize a target and peck at its image until the weapon corrected its course. This was Project Pigeon, one of the strangest documented weapons experiments of the Second World War. It was proposed by B.F. Skinner, a psychologist known for his work on behavior, reinforcement, and animal learning. To most people today, the phrase pigeon-guided missile sounds like a joke made after the fact, the kind of bizarre wartime rumor that grows larger every time it is repeated. But Project Pigeon was real. A prototype nose cone survives in the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. Skinner later wrote about the project himself. The B.F. Skinner Foundation preserves film and description of the training. The U.S. Army has also discussed the program in historical material. The story matters not because a pigeon-guided weapon ever changed the war. It did not, but because it shows how desperate and imaginative wartime research could become when the old ways of aiming were no longer enough. The central question is not whether America almost won the war with birds. That would be misleading. No pigeon-guided missile was ever used in combat. No ship was sunk by one. No city was bombed by one. The real question is more interesting. Why did respected scientists, engineers, military officials, and a major American company spend time and money studying an idea that appeared ridiculous on the surface? To answer that, we have to return to the early 1940s, before satellite navigation, before digital computers and weapons, before laser-guided bombs, and before modern precision strike. In that world, a human bombardier looking through a sight might be the most sophisticated guidance system available. Aiming from the air was not a clean mathematical exercise. It was a violent, unstable act performed inside a moving aircraft, under pressure, often through weather, enemy fire, and mechanical uncertainty. Project Pigeon grew out of that problem. For the United States Army Air Forces, precision bombing was not only a technical ambition, it was part of doctrine. American air planners believed that aircraft could strike industrial and military targets with enough accuracy to cripple an enemy's ability to fight. But doctrine was one thing, and combat was another. Even advanced bomb sights had limits. A target might be obscured by clouds, a bomber formation might be shaken by flak. Winds could push falling bombs off course. Enemy fighters could force crews to maneuver. A bombardier could only aim before release. After that, the bomb was unguided. The National Museum of the U.S. Air Force describes bombing as a technical problem that demanded solutions in sighting, stability, and aircraft control. In that context, guidance after release became a prize. If a weapon could keep correcting itself toward the target, the entire logic of air attack would change. Skinner approached that problem from an unusual direction. He was not a weapons designer by training. He was a psychologist, then associated with the University of Minnesota, and his expertise was the study of behavior under controlled conditions. Skinner believed that behavior could be shaped by consequences. If an action was followed by reinforcement, the organism became more likely to repeat that action. In the laboratory, this could produce highly reliable patterns of behavior. A pigeon could be trained to peck a target. It could be trained to discriminate between shapes. It could be trained to maintain a response over time. To Skinner, these were not parlor tricks. They were evidence that living organisms could perform specific tasks with consistency if the conditions were carefully designed. When war made guidance a matter of life, death, and national survival, he began to see animal behavior as something more than a subject of study. The story often begins with the image of Skinner looking at birds and imagining them as natural guidance systems. Whether one treats that moment as memory, reflection, or later storytelling, the logic behind it is clear. Birds possess visual abilities that humans had long exploited indirectly. Messenger pigeons had already served militaries by carrying information when wires, radios, or runners were unreliable. They were not machines, but they could be trained. They could function under conditions that might confuse or interrupt technology. Skinner's leap was to ask whether a pigeon could do something even more specific, not carry a message, but continuously report the position of a target. The pigeon would not know it was guiding a missile. It would not understand war. It would simply see an image and peck at the trained pattern. Its behavior would become part of a control system. Project Pigeon did not begin as a fully formed weapon. Skinner later wrote that the earliest idea involved a homing device for a surface-to-air missile, something that could be used as a defense against aircraft. The late 1930s and early 1940s were filled with fear of air attack. The bombing of Warsaw in 1939 and the wider terror of aerial bombardment had shown that cities and civilians were now vulnerable from the sky. Defending against aircraft was a desperate challenge, but as the balance of weapons changed, the project shifted direction. Instead of guiding a surface-to-air weapon, the Pigeon system was considered for an air-to-ground missile known as the Pelican. This Pelican was a wing-steered glider under development. It was not yet a proven weapon waiting only for a bird. It was part of an experimental field where many pieces were still uncertain. The Pelican itself reveals something important about wartime technology. Skinner explained that its name reflected the awkward state of American missile development at the time. Detection devices and control mechanisms took up so much space that there was little room left for explosives. In other words, the weapon's guidance and mechanical systems threatened to consume the very space needed for the payload. This is the kind of detail that makes Project Pigeon more than a curiosity. It shows a period when guided weapons were not sleek, compact, and predictable. They were bulky, experimental, and full of compromises. Engineers were trying to make sensors, servos, control surfaces, and targeting systems work together with limited materials and incomplete information. Into that messy technological environment came Skinner's proposal: use the pigeon as the visual detector and behavioral controller. The basic system was conceptually simple. A lens in the nose of the weapon would project the target area onto a translucent screen. A pigeon, held inside a small compartment, would face that screen. The bird had been trained to peck at the target image. If the projected target remained centered, the bird's pecks would remain centered. If the missile drifted and the target image shifted away from the center, the pigeon would keep striking the image wherever it moved. Those off-center pecks could then be translated into correction signals, telling the weapon's control system which direction to adjust. The pigeon was not steering with intention. It was behaving under training. But in a control system, intention was not required. The only question was whether the signal could be reliable, fast enough, and accurate enough to matter. The earliest tests were surprisingly physical. In the spring of 1940, at the University of Minnesota, Skinner tested whether a pigeon could guide movement toward a target using a moving hoist. The bird was held in a harness, able to move its head and neck. By moving its head in certain directions, it could affect the motion of the apparatus. The goal was a bullseye where food was available. As the system moved toward the wall, the pigeon had to correct its position to reach the center. This was not a missile test. It was a behavioral demonstration. Could a pigeon learn to correct its own path toward a visual target? According to Skinner's account, it could. That small laboratory result became the seed of something much larger, the idea that a trained animal might function as a guidance component. After Pearl Harbor, the urgency of American wartime research changed overnight. Ideas that had once seemed too speculative could be reconsidered under a different pressure. Skinner continued the work with help from colleagues, including Keller Breland, who was then a graduate student at Minnesota. The research moved from the simple hoist concept toward more realistic tracking tasks. If a bomb rotated during descent, perhaps the pigeon would only need to correct in one dimension. If an image could be projected onto a screen, perhaps the bird could peck at the image rather than physically steer its own body. Each step moved the concept away from a crude animal trick and toward a more engineered system. The laboratory became a strange meeting point between psychology, optics, mechanics, and military imagination. Skinner and his team trained birds to respond to target patterns. In some experiments, models of ships or target shapes were moved through the visual field. The pigeon was reinforced for pecking at the correct image. Over time, the training could become more refined. The bird could learn not merely to peck randomly, but to maintain contact with the important visual pattern. Skinner's later account describes training pigeons to follow different land and sea targets, to ignore distracting areas that might represent clouds or flak, and to continue responding over sustained periods. These details are crucial because they separate the true story from the cartoon version. The project was not put a bird in a bomb and hope. It was a systematic attempt to study whether animal discrimination and reinforcement schedules could produce a usable guidance signal. Support was difficult to find. Skinner's proposal passed through a series of skeptical reactions, which should not surprise us. Scientists and military officials were being asked to consider a weapon whose most visible component was a live bird. The idea sounded eccentric even during a war filled with eccentric ideas. But then, General Mills entered the story. Today, the company is remembered mostly as a food company. But during the war, it had engineering capacity and became involved in technical work. According to Skinner and later accounts, General Mills reviewed the pigeon work and helped advance the idea toward a formal presentation. This is one of the details that gives Project Pigeon its strange American texture. A university psychologist, trained birds, wartime science, and a major commercial company drawn into the machinery of military research. In June 1943, the Office of Scientific Research and Development awarded a contract to General Mills to develop a homing device. That contract matters. It means Project Pigeon was not only a private experiment in Skinner's laboratory. It had crossed, briefly, into the official world of wartime research. The amount was modest compared with the massive scale of other weapons programs, but the symbolic meaning was significant. The United States was willing to test whether a living organism could be integrated into the guidance of a weapon. At the same time, the project remained constrained. Security restrictions meant Skinner's team did not receive full details of the Pelican's control system. They had to design their signal with only rough knowledge of what the missile required. That lack of information would later become one of the project's central weaknesses. The Pelican target used in testing was not an enemy ship under fire. Skinner described a target in New Jersey, a stirrup-shaped pattern bulldozed into sandy soil near the coast. The white lines stood out against the surrounding ground. Photographs were taken from different distances and angles so that the target image could be reproduced for training. This detail is visually important for the documentary. The pigeons were not being trained on abstract dots alone. They were being trained against images that represented what a missile might see as it approached a target from the air. Aerial photography, projection, and animal behavior were being tied together in a single experimental chain. The pigeon would see a miniature version of the battlefield, not as a strategist, but as a trained responder to shape and position. The mechanical pickup system was one of the most important parts of the design. A lens projected the image onto a translucent plate within reach of the pigeon. Around the plate were valves linked to a pneumatic system. When the pigeon pecked near the center, the signals balanced. But if the image moved off-center and the bird followed it, pecks on one side of the plate would create a different pressure signal. That signal could be sent to the control system, theoretically ordering the missile to correct its course. Skinner's account describes this as a graded signal rather than a simple on-off response. This is where the project becomes more sophisticated than the headline suggests. The pigeon was not just pressing a button. Its peck location was meant to communicate direction and degree of error. Then came the most famous design feature, 3 pigeons. The Smithsonian describes Skinner's prototype nose cone as having 3 compartments, each with a window. In Skinner's account, there was enough space in the nose of the Pelican for a multiple bird unit, and this offered an engineering advantage. A single bird might pause, become distracted, or produce an irregular response. 3 birds could create redundancy. Their signals could be combined. In one version of the logic, at least 2 birds had to agree on the same target. The third could be corrected by the reinforcement system. It sounds bizarre when spoken plainly. A democratic vote of pigeons inside a missile. But the underlying principle is familiar to engineers. Critical systems often use redundancy because no single component can be trusted completely. General Mills engineers also built a simulator to test the pigeon signal. Skinner compared it to a kind of trainer for pigeons, designed to imitate the steering behavior of the Pelican as far as the team understood it. Targets moved across a room while the 3-bird unit attempted to track them. The simulator tilted and moved. The loop could be closed, meaning the bird's behavior affected the system, and the system's movement changed what the birds saw. This is the heart of feedback control. The target image moves, the birds respond. Their response changes the machine. The changed machine changes the image again. In modern language, it was a biological control loop. That is why Project Pigeon deserves more than ridicule. It was strange, yes, but it was also part of a broader search for feedback, automation, and guided weapons. Skinner's team did not only ask whether pigeons could peck, they asked whether they could continue pecking under conditions that might resemble combat stress. According to Skinner, the researchers studied temperature extremes, atmospheric pressure changes, acceleration, vibration, carbon dioxide pressure, and noise, including sharp sounds. They also studied the effects of deprivation and reinforcement because the bird's motivation was central to the system. A pigeon that stopped responding was not merely a tired animal, it was a failed guidance component. This part of the story is uncomfortable, and it should be handled carefully. It shows how wartime research can turn living beings into instruments. The birds were not symbolic. They were being evaluated for reliability, endurance, and control, just as a mechanical device might be evaluated. By December 1943, less than 6 months after the General Mills contract had been awarded, Skinner's team was ready to report. Observers from the Office of Scientific Research and Development came to see the system. They watched the simulator follow a target under the control of 3 pigeons. They reviewed tracking data. On one level, this was a serious technical demonstration. On another level, it was a psychological test of the observers themselves. Could trained scientists and officials look past the absurdity of the animal and evaluate the signal? Skinner later believed that this was one of the great barriers. The pigeon behaved as trained, but the sight of a living bird inside a weapon system made the proposal feel unserious to the very people whose approval it needed. This is where the story becomes more subtle than "they laughed and canceled it." The project faced real technical concerns. The signal had to match the Pelican's control requirements. The servo link had to be adequate. The team had limited access to classified missile details, which made the engineering task harder. Some later scholarship has emphasized that the official doubts were not only prejudice against pigeons, but also concerns about whether the system could be practically integrated into the missile. That distinction matters. Project Pigeon was not rejected only because people were narrow-minded. It was rejected because wartime decision-makers had to decide which experimental systems deserved further development. A strange idea had to be possible, credible, and militarily urgent. Project Pigeon struggled to satisfy all 3. In January 1944, the Office of Scientific Research and Development refused to extend the General Mills contract. Skinner sought reconsideration, but the project did not continue as a wartime weapon program. The official reasoning, as reflected in later discussion, focused on the belief that further work would delay other projects with more immediate combat promise. That phrase reveals the ruthless economy of wartime science. Researchers could produce fascinating results and still lose support. A working demonstration was not enough. The project had to compete against radar, electronics, conventional weapons development, aircraft production, and many other urgent demands. Project Pigeon may have shown that pigeons could perform the task in a laboratory, but it did not convince decision-makers that the system belonged in combat. After the contract ended, the equipment was scrapped. Skinner wrote that some of the pigeons were kept to see how long they would retain the trained behavior. This detail gives the story a haunting afterlife. The machine was gone, but the behavior remained. The birds had learned a target, a response, a pattern of action produced by months of controlled reinforcement. In the logic of war, they were obsolete before they ever flew. In the logic of behavioral science, they were evidence of something durable and measurable. That tension runs through the entire story. Project Pigeon failed as a weapon, but it helped demonstrate Skinner's belief that behavior could be engineered with remarkable precision under the right conditions. The idea did not disappear after the Second World War. In 1948, interest returned under the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory in a continuation known as ORCON, short for Organic Control. The post-war environment had changed. The discovery of German guided missile work had made the guided weapons problem even more urgent. Engineers and military planners could no longer dismiss guidance as a distant fantasy. Missiles were becoming central to the future of warfare. ORCON revisited the idea of using pigeons to guide weapons, especially against ships. The Navy's renewed interest shows that the concept was not simply thrown away as madness. It remained technically intriguing enough to examine again, even after the original wartime contract had failed. In the ORCON version, the system became more refined. Skinner described a semiconducting screen and a contact on the bird's beak that could report the location of the target more directly. The pigeon's peck would no longer be only a crude mechanical event. It could become part of a more precise signal system. This is important for the documentary because it links Project Pigeon to the larger history of human-machine and organism-machine interfaces. The pigeon was being used as a visual detector, a pattern recognizer, and a reporting mechanism. Long before modern artificial intelligence, before compact digital image recognition, before autonomous drones, military researchers were asking how a system could identify a target in a complex visual field. One answer, however strange, was to use an animal that had already evolved remarkable vision. But ORCON also ended. By the early 1950s, electronic guidance systems were becoming more reliable, and the case for an organic guidance system weakened. Radar, control electronics, and other technologies were moving quickly. The U.S. Army's historical account notes that the Army's own pigeon breeding and training program was discontinued in 1957 as radar and electronic communication became reliable enough. That is not the same program as Project Pigeon, but it reflects the broader technological shift. The age in which birds seemed like a possible solution to military communication and guidance problems was closing. The machine was catching up. Once electronics could do the work more predictably, commanders no longer needed to imagine a bird pecking inside the nose of a missile. The Smithsonian's preserved nose cone is therefore not a monument to a successful weapon. It is a relic of a moment when the future was uncertain. The object is made of ordinary materials, but its meaning is extraordinary. It represents a time when American scientists were willing to try combinations that now seem impossible: psychology and missile guidance, animal training and military engineering, reinforcement schedules and aerial attack. Its description is careful. The prototype was never developed, but it influenced later work on animal training. That wording matters. It gives the story its proper scale. Project Pigeon was not a battlefield breakthrough. It was not a war-winning secret. It was an experimental dead end as a weapon, but a revealing episode in the history of behavior, technology, and war. There is also an ethical question that should not be ignored. The pigeons would not have survived an operational mission. If the system had been used, the animals would have been part of a weapon designed to destroy itself and its target. Skinner himself recognized the ethical discomfort, though he framed it in the context of a world facing mass violence and aerial war. For a documentary audience, this is not a place for cheap jokes. The birds were not villains, heroes, or comic relief. They were living creatures drawn into a human conflict they could not understand. That fact does not make the story less historically important. It makes it more revealing. War expands the category of what humans are willing to use, and sometimes that includes life itself as a component of machinery. The deeper lesson of Project Pigeon is not that wartime scientists were foolish. It is that war accelerates strange questions. What counts as intelligence? What counts as a machine? What counts as control? In the 1940s, a pigeon could recognize a pattern more flexibly than many available devices. That did not make it a practical weapon, but it did make it interesting. Today, we live in a world of guided munitions, drones, computer vision, and autonomous targeting debates. Project Pigeon sits far behind those systems, primitive and almost unbelievable. Yet it points toward the same central problem: how to make a weapon perceive. Skinner's birds were not computers, but they were being asked to do a task that modern computers would later be built to perform: find the target and keep the system locked on it. In the end, Project Pigeon remains one of the most unusual military experiments of the Second World War because it was both absurd and serious at the same time. It was absurd in image: 3 pigeons sealed into the nose of a missile, pecking at projected targets while engineers watched data. But it was serious in purpose: keeping pilots farther from danger, improving accuracy, and solving a guidance problem that defined the future of air warfare. It failed as an operational weapon, and that must be stated clearly. But as a story, it opens a door into the hidden workshop of wartime invention, where fear, imagination, science, and urgency produced ideas that still challenge our sense of what military technology is supposed to look like. If this story helped you see the war from a different angle, leave a like, subscribe to Declassified War Stories, and turn on notifications, because some of the most important battles were never told on the front page.